Shabbat Shalom, everybody. My topic for today is a more rigorous approach to this idea called moral realism. I talked about it tonight. I connected it to the war in Israel between Israel and Hamas, but I want to more purely devote this to giving all of you some basic grounding in the study of morals. So as I said a little bit earlier, morals, by the way, it's the Greek, it's a Latin term that comes from mores. Mores are understood to be customs, and morals means this. And this is an agreement of every moral philosopher today. Morals has to do with an obligation. We are obligated to do some things and obligated not to do other things. So if you hear the word moral, immediately think of obligations and duties. Obligations and duties. Obligated to do some things, obligated not to do other things. Now, the Greek word ethics, more or less synonymous with morals. So when people say morals and ethics, what they're really saying is morals and morals or ethics and ethics, but it's okay. People use it for emphasis. Just for your knowledge, in my study of moral philosophy, how did we understand the distinction between morals and ethics? And again, this is not universally accepted, but I'll say it was the way that it was taught in my graduate program in religion and social ethics, where we studied moral philosophy. Morals was understood to be something, number one, general, including all moral philosophy and all the different types of moral philosophy. And I can list them for you. I'll list a few different types of them today. And oftentimes talking about issues that are somewhat egregious, for an immoral act versus an unethical act. So what does ethics mean? Again, according to the way that I was taught it, and I like to use it this way. Morals is the general discipline of obligations to do and not do something. Ethics, as I was taught it, refers to specialized fields of morals. Therefore, we say business ethics, legal ethics, clergy ethics, synagogue ethics, family. You can even talk about family ethics, which I do, or even marriage ethics. So anywhere where there's a specific kind of human relationship, we can think that ethics is the application of morals to a specific area. Not everybody agrees. I'm not telling you this is true. I'm just telling you this is how the words are used, oftentimes in programs in moral philosophy, and my program, which was called Religion-Social Ethics. So now I want to talk about specifically the idea of in morals, which means moral philosophy in general, and especially the kind that I subscribe to, which is morals has to do with duty. And you'll see in a moment why that is so important. Now remember, I do start with values, because a value is, as the word sounds, something that we value. Now, if we value it in a moral sense, we have a duty. Now, let's say, for example, I value culture. Well, that sounds good. There's not a downside to it if we agree in general that culture's a good thing. And let's say I give money to the LA County Museum of Art because I value culture. So I say, okay, since I value culture, I'll be a member of LACMA because I value art. Now, do I have an obligation to go down there once a year? I say, well, yeah, because I value art, I will go down there. One reason I let my membership lapse is because I was a member, but I never went. So in general, non-moral values means we value something. For example, when a person says family values, what they oftentimes mean is the value of family. They value family. But then why do they value family? So by family values, they're partly asking the question why they value family or why they value friendship. I hope you're following me. And we value friendships, we value families because they are areas where our human potential can actually find its full expression. When I think what it means to be a human being, part of what it means to a human being is to love and be loved. Part of what it means to be a human being is to be in service to other people. And in families and in close friendships, we live out the value of loving and being loved, being of service. And typically, families and close relationships are the arenas where love and service are uniquely expressed. But let's say we discover a family where there's not much love, where there's acrimony and bitterness, and no one lives in service to the other people. Now, I would say that now this is judgmental, that family is not living up to the value of family. So when we say, for example, family and friendships, we value certain kinds of families, certain ways of being a family, certain kinds of friendships. So a friendship that, for example, is characterized by bitterness, betrayal, domination, etc., the value of friendship, you might say, is not lived out in that kind of a friendship. So that's why it's very careful when a person says, I value friendship, I value my friends, I value my family. How are other values lived out in that unique context called family and friends? So I'll break this down one more time because it might be brand new to some people. Oftentimes when I teach morals and values to 7th, 8th graders, I'd start with one of the most important values that they have, which is friendships. In early adolescence, children start to move from the context of family to the context of peers, friendships, etc. It's a natural part of adolescent development. And then they find themselves with groups of people. They want to have friends. They want people to like them. They want companionship. All of those things are natural to the human condition, but they're not actually moral values. Why? Because you can have a companion who's actually a bad person. And it actually says in our morning prayers, keep me from a bad companion. Because people long for companionship so much, meaning the value of companionship, that the value of companionship will override a moral value of being a decent human being. And sometimes people do things according to the dictates of a companion that actually violate moral values. I'll define what that is in just a moment. So when you think about values, what people value, what we value has to be judged by, ultimately, by moral values. So if I value if I value friendship in general, and I value a certain person because I want us to be friends, and then I find that that person acts in immoral ways, I'll define that in just a moment, I have a moral obligation not to be with that person, not to hang out with that person, not give that person what I'm going to call what I'll say the investment of my energy, spiritual energies, into a relationship where the other person is not being a moral person. I'll come back to that if there are questions, but it's important if you want to understand morals, meaning moral obligations, and in specific context, ethical obligations. One has to understand values, and that there are moral values and non-moral values, and everything that is what I'm going to call non-moral doesn't mean bad. It just doesn't mean it's necessarily moral. You have to investigate whether it's moral. So just to rephrase, if a young person naturally values companionship, it's a natural value. It's not moral or immoral. It's just a value. It has to be assessed on a moral dimension. So what are some moral values? And by, again, a moral value, I mean in general, applies to all people at all times. All people should value life. Now remember, this is a judgment. I have to emphasize, you cannot prove it to a skeptic. If a skeptic says, prove to me that I am obligated to respect life, you can't. So always remember, morals cannot be proven in any rational or empirical way. So that's why High Holidays we focus that moral values are an existential decision. You cannot persuade a skeptic. There's no standard that everybody would agree to that says a person has to value life. They can say, I don't value life. I value my self-interest. Or as we saw in the 20th century, the state was of premium value. For example, under communism, Soviet Union, Maoist China, National Socialism, and other places, where the state had ultimate value, as understood by its typically self-appointed leaders, never democratically elected, at least not a second time. They would claim the state has ultimate value, which meant their will, and therefore individual lives had no value. So the value of life, you'll see under some systems, especially Marxism, communism, National Socialism, etc., there is not a value of the individual human life, there's the value of the state or of the class. And when you go into modern critical theory, which breaks the idea of the workers versus the ruling class, the owners versus the workers, is spread out. And many people feel that certain kinds of people, I know it sounds distressing, have more value than others. Their lives have more value than others. I don't want to talk about the war between Israel and Hamas, but you can see that immediately. Not all lives have value, only some lives have value. The life of the oppressed has more value under Marxian systems, and the life of the oppressor, the colonialist, the imperialist, the Zionist, has no value. Now, that's one of the distressing things, that there are some systems of thought, and nowadays it would be Marxism, communism, and all their offshoots, liberation theory, any values that come from the so-called critical studies tradition. There is not an ultimate value placed on the equality of human beings, let's say when it comes to basic human rights. Now, so I would say, I believe, and I can't prove it to a skeptic, I can never prove this to a Nazi, I can never prove this to a Marxist, that human beings are equal in their right to life. Now, so it doesn't matter their race, religion, nation, political point of views, it's a completely equal right to life. And the right to life can only be subject to something else if it is a competing moral value. So remember, there are competing moral values. So the right to life is a value, but the right to self-defense is also a value, which means I can prefer my life over a person who's trying to murder me. So when you study moral theory, it does break down and become more complex, but I'm just going to put out there respect for life, especially the life of innocence. I'll say it this way. Our basic moral duty to not cause intentional, unnecessary, avoidable harm to the innocent. You can memorize that. Our basic moral duty, remember, morals has to do with duties and obligations, to do and not do certain things. Our basic moral duty is to not cause intentional, unnecessary, avoidable harm to the innocent. Now, by innocent, I don't mean that they've never done anything wrong. It means they don't deserve harm in a given instance. They're not deserving of harm. You might say obligation is one side, deserving is the other. So if, for example, if I have an obligation to respect life, this person over here deserves my respect for their life. So I don't want to go into that too much, but obligations on one side creates deserving on the other side. Okay. Now, if that's my basic moral obligation, not to cause intentional, unnecessary, avoidable harm to those who do not deserve harm, okay, that's a basic moral value. What are some other basic moral values? And again, these cannot be proven. You cannot prove it to a skeptic. You can't prove it in the Soviet Union. You can't prove it in Nazi Germany or in many countries that people have the right of liberty and therefore the moral obligation to preserve someone's liberty. So let me talk a little bit more at this point, because when we think of liberty, we think of it as a right, not as a duty. So I'm going to do another chapter here, which is the connection between obligations and rights. If you look at the history of Western moral thought and Western law, with which I'm most familiar, the word rights did not exist until sometime in the 14, 15, 1600s. It was what is right. We had the obligation to do the right thing. The Hebrew word tzedek is used as the sense of it's justice, but it means to be right in a moral sense. I have an obligation to do the right thing. Now that's, again, is just intrinsic to the word moral. When does the word rights come up? Rights means a human right against the government or other people. So right to property means other people can't take it. The right to free speech means other people can't interfere with my speaking. So rights is another way of talking about morality. So right is a claim against the immoral behavior of other people. Now, why did this idea develop? Because the idea of human rights began to develop in opposition to the state. There was a time, remember, of the divine right of kings, that all people who were not in the nobility, the aristocracy, had an obligation to follow the demands of their cultural superiors. As the idea of human rights began to develop, the idea was, I have certain rights, and my rights cannot be violated without due process. This is the 14th Amendment. let's say a person says, I have a right to an education. I want you to think about that. I have a right to an education. Therefore, somebody's obligated to teach me. Can you all see that? A right to an education could mean another person has an obligation to teach me. Now, what if nobody wants to be my teacher? Ought the government force someone to be my teacher? If I have a right to an education and my government is here to protect my rights, one could think that a person could be drafted to become my teacher because my right to have an education is greater than their right to liberty. So I personally believe from my training, we do not have rights to things. We have rights from other people that then turn into what are called entitlements. For example, the right to a fair trial is in some sense my right to liberty, the obligation of other people to leave me alone. And if they're going to interfere with my liberty and property, there has to be just cause typically understood in law. So I don't believe I have a right to an education. I believe that people are prohibited from interfering with my desire to become educated. I don't think I can force anyone to educate me. For example, if I believe that I have a right, a woman has a right to an abortion, it doesn't mean that someone is obligated to provide the abortion. It's just that the government can't get in the middle of that. If I have the right to vote, you might say that the government has an obligation to set up a voting system. What if they don't? Well, then we can vote for representatives that will set up a fair voting system. So when you think of the right to something, always remember that the right to something can impact another person's obligations to us. So there are many questions when people talk about, for example, the rights of non-human objects. For example, the right forests, the rights of trees, the rights of nature. It's very strange language in ethics because a right is something that has typically claimed by a human being. I don't, for example, believe that nature has a right, but we human beings have an obligation to protect nature. So when you start to think about the language of morals, think of obligations and rights, which came into being in the 14, 15, 1600s, was a wall against other people interfering with our dignity as human beings and have an obligation not to interfere with us. And so rights are brought up to create obligations of other people, but not every right is an obligation. So when we talk about rights, we have to be very careful. I was in a study group one time, and a person said, I have very upset that the city of Los Angeles was not providing enough police officers. And a person said, I have a right to walk around freely and to walk around unafraid. You ever thought about that? I have a right to walk around unafraid. Well, if I have a right, it means other people have an obligation not to make me afraid. Now, try to think about that. Do other people have the obligation not make me afraid? Well, if they're law-abiding, they already have that obligation. But how much ought the city do to make sure that none of us is afraid? Well, then we have to, as a city, decide how much are we going to spend on police to make sure there's a police officer at every corner and nobody is ever afraid. I don't think that's ever existed in humanity. So I looked at the person and said, I'm not sure if you have a right to walk around unafraid. Well, they were very upset with me because it's a desire. The desire to walk around unafraid, but if you're going to have a right to something, that means somebody else has to do or not do something. Is that clear? So I like to be very careful of the idea of rights, especially natural rights, means a right to walk around unafraid. We citizens can say we would like to walk around unafraid and therefore create a governmental obligation to protect us. If you ever want to think about these things clearly, try to imagine there's 100 people out in the forest trying to make their way. And a person says, well, I want 10 people to be in our local police force to protect us. And no one wants to do it. Now, I have a right to not have my property stolen. Does my 100-person community have an obligation to create a police force? Well, I think that would require a democratic vote. When you get down into the weeds of these things, it's very complex. But the main thing is to understand that when you talk about morals, you're discussing obligations, A fundamental obligation is respect for life, context obviously. Liberty is more of a right than an obligation. Justice, for example, we have a moral duty to be just to others, and therefore other people have a right to due process, for example, in the 14th Amendment. Peace is a value, but interestingly, not a moral value. I know this can sound a little bit disturbing, but sometimes people will say, no justice, no peace. What they're saying is, if I don't get justice as I consider justice to be, I will commit acts of violence, which obviously violates the moral obligation not to hurt the person and property of other people. So I find no justice, no peace, for example, to be offensive. Because sometimes, in order to, let's say, in the Civil War in the United States, to put down an insurrection, to put down the attempted secession of the Confederate States, there's a war. Now, the South could have said, we have a right to secede from the Union. That's actually contestable. But in our history, it was decided that there is no right to secede from the Union. And therefore, the North had an obligation to go to war and bring the Southern states back into the Union. So sometimes we have an obligation to go to war. I think the obligation to go to war to ultimately to eradicate slavery, which meant bringing the Southern states back into the Union where slavery would be abolished in all of the United States. I think that's an obligation to go to war in service of respect for the life and liberty of other people. So going to war, morally speaking, is to protect the life and liberty and property of citizens. War can be an option or it can be an obligation. A war of self-defense is typically a moral obligation. When we think about peace, remember, peace is a non-moral value. Because if somebody is violating the rights of others in an egregious sense, such as murder, slaughter, and atrocities, peace is not a value, it's not a moral value. War is a moral value. Now, so peace, you might say, is a non-moral value, which means it would be great if there were peace, unless evil has to be eradicated. Then the eradication of evil is actually a moral value. Always remember that sometimes when people say no justice, which I think is a moral value, no peace, which is a non-moral value, as someone who studies ethics, remember, I'm hyper vigilant for these kinds of statements. Because when a person says no justice, no peace, I think they mean if I don't feel I get justice, I have a right to harm others. That's what it sounds like it means. I think people might think it. I don't know if they're going to do it when they chant those words. But as an ethicist, my antenna goes up. Because I don't think, for example, if I don't get the justice I think I deserve, I don't think that I am then authorized to damage the person or property of other people. That's just the way that I think. I might be right, I might be wrong. But you can see that when you have some training in morals and ethics, you start to think about these things very carefully. What is moral obligations? What are our obligations? Typically, respect for life, liberty, and I'll say the person, property of others, and therefore this comes into the obligation to be just. And then as far as a social obligation, the obligation to set up fair courts of justice. Okay? So that's when we think about morals and moral realism, we really do have obligations. Obligations, first of all, not to harm, and as I put it a little bit earlier, not to cause intentional, unnecessary, avoidable harm to those who don't deserve harm, and more further, if you want to, benefit the worthy when possible. By the way, that's contested. Do I have an obligate to benefit worthy people? Some say yes, some say no. Now, another thing, remember in moral realism, I believe as a moral realist, we absolutely have moral obligations to do and not do certain things. Okay? If you look at the Ten Commandments, for example, the duty not to murder, the duty not to steal are probably primary moral values. Meaning, these are not from society, because some societies might provoke murder and theft, and some do. This is not subjective, meaning I don't think I should murder. That's my subjective value. It's not really moral or not moral. It's just my personal decision. If you choose to murder, that's your problem. I have my morals, you have yours. That's moral realism. Realism holds that these moral values, these moral obligations in general apply to all places at all times. And so this is the great mistake I think is being made with young people, is that because we want to be tolerant, we don't want to sound judgmental. So when a person says, my values are right, your values are wrong, people get upset. Well, why are your values better than my values? So I don't like to say they're my values. They're what I call the values of moral realism that I happen to hold. Person says, well, I have a different opinion. Nobody has a right to life. Nobody has a right to their property. I can do anything that I want. Well, I would call those immoral values. I mean, they're values, they're just immoral values. So what can I say as a moral realist? I say as a moral realist, I believe I have basic obligations that are real because the value of life is real. Not because we decided as a society, not because I decided, because it's been pre-decided in some kind of metaphysical sense. But a person says, well, I don't believe that. I'm stuck with saying people are not going to like. I have to say, well, then you have bad values. You have immoral values. They say, well, who are you? Isn't my opinion equal to yours? I have to say, not all opinions are equal. It's clearly that you're equal to me in the eyes of the law and the eyes of God, but our opinions are not equal because I believe that people whose opinions align with moral realism, for example, the obligation to respect life, liberty, property of others, I think that's real. If a person says, I value myself, and therefore I have no obligation to respect the life, liberty, and property of others, I would say those are bad values. Now, there was a time when anybody could say that. It was obvious in any decent society, but because of the value of tolerance in our society, you had this very, very corrupt idea that because people are equal in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of God, I'll stress, all opinions are equal. Well, that is clearly not so. Just check out mathematics and physics. Clearly, all knowledge in physics is not equal. I mean, if I was going to have an airliner built, I don't want it built by physics relativists. I want it built by real physicists. Okay, so just as in the realm of mathematics and physics, there are, you might call, the real knowledge, and it's not subjective. I can't say, well, I don't like physics, I'm going to get my own physics. I would say, well, then you fly your own airplane. I'm not flying in your airplane. Now, this makes it very tough because, as I said last night, I think one of the main values we have taught in the Jewish tradition, and ever since I was a kid, all the way through, the main value of tolerance and not the idea of moral obligations, because moral obligations sounded judgmental, especially when you said another person is not following their moral obligations. So the idea is, well, we have to be tolerant, that everybody's viewpoint is the same, their values are just different, they're not better and worse. You've probably heard this your whole life. Values aren't better and worse, they're just different. Well, I disagree, because I'm a moral realist. So if you have a society that does not respect human rights, does not respect due process under the law, does not respect freedom of speech, I'm going to call that bad values. Again, the pushback is, who are you to say some values are better than other values? Now, that's a tough conversation. I want to remind you, if you ever try to have this conversation, that a culture, society, or state that does not respect, for example, women's rights, rights of any person of difference, violation of rights based on race, gender orientation, etc., rights based on religion. I mean, I'm very American in this way. You can see I'm very attached to the idea of a liberal democracy, which means democracy with a regime of rights. I will say those are bad values. And ideally, if I could wave a magic wand, I would change their values. I'm just going to ask you, if there were a society that believed in murdering people who dissented, where there was no right to free speech, no right to due process, that the leaders murdered people at will, and you could wave a magic wand, would you change their values? See, if you wouldn't, I believe you're not a moral person. That's what I believe. Because if you could create a moral regime, a moral setting with a wave of a wand, nothing on you, just the wand has the power. You don't have to do anything except wave it. And you could create justice, and you choose not to because you think that all views are equal, all opinions are equal, all values are equal, and all societies are equal, I think that's not a moral perspective. I think it is tolerance run amok. So when I look at, now specifically Jewish education through my entire life, we were never taught ever, not in Hebrew school, confirmation, rabbinical school, ever, about moral obligations. In this sense, I mean, theoretically, we talk about Jewish ethics, but I remember when I studied in graduate school and I was then brought back as an adjunct lecturer in Talmud and different things. Talmud professor was on sabbatical, so I came in and taught Talmud a few semesters. And we're studying something in civil law, which, remember, civil law is rooted in moral obligations, as is criminal law, but we were studying civil law. And I talked about a priori moral obligation to respect the rights, liberty, and property of other people. And they said, well, that sounds kind of judgmental. What about other societies? I said, I'm sorry, I don't think there's anywhere in the Jewish tradition that says, however, if there's a society that does not respect the life, liberty, property of other people, that's okay. It's all equal. In fact, if you look at the Noahide laws in Judaism, you can look this up, the six or seven Noahide laws, forget momentarily, there is an obligation that if the Jewish state, understood from a rabbinic understanding of when there was Jewish sovereignty, comes into a region where there is no justice, there's an obligation to establish just courts. I want you to think about this for a moment. This is an obligation of the Jewish sovereign state that if it encounters a region where there is no justice, to create justice and to make sure that whatever this indigenous population is, whether it's Hittites, Jebusites, Canaanites, or anybody else, we have an obligation to set up a just legal system. Now, ask yourself, is that really a right or an obligation that whenever we, let's say as a country, let's say the United States comes into an area and we have the ability to set up just courts, do we have an obligation to do so? According to Jewish law, we absolutely do. And you can tell how this relates to things today. I'm one of those who believe in the absolute nature of moral realism, which means there really are better and worse answers to moral questions, number one. Not that I know exactly what a moral question is, not know what the answers is, but I have certain premises, certain axioms I'll borrow from our declaration, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I cannot prove it to a skeptic, but once I have basic axioms, let's say as a moral realist, that these axioms really do refer to metaphysical realities. The moral obligation to preserve life. It's not empirical. I can't test it. I can't persuade a skeptic, but I believe it's real. Somebody asked me, well, Rabbi Finley, do you mean God? I said, maybe, but it depends on what the word God connotes to you. So sometimes when I say God-given rights, they said, oh, so you believe in the parting of the Red Sea, you believe the Garden of Eden was actual history, and you believe where it says stone a person who does this or that. I realize if I say the word God, it brings in a whole baggage of nothing that I mean. So if you're asking, as a person did, why don't I mention the word God? Because we have such different understandings of the word God means I'd rather not say it. I would rather say moral obligations not rooted in any kind of empirical or social reality, but rather exist metaphysically, that we're obligated to do them, not because the government obligated it, because I might live in a corrupt government that doesn't have that obligation. Okay? That's where you all, in my opinion, have a very deep decision to make about how you think about these things. Do you believe that human beings, in a real sense, not a social accord sense, not a social contract sense, but in a real sense, have certain duties and obligations toward other people, whether the government requires it of you or not, and even if the government requires that you do something opposite? If the government requires that you kill innocent people, you have a moral obligation not to kill innocent people. It doesn't matter what the government says. It doesn't matter what your friends and neighbors say. You have an obligation not to kill innocent people. If you're listening to this, I just want you to look inside for a moment and say, am I a moral realist? Do I believe that there are, for example, obligations that exist that are not constructed by people, because people can be so corrupt and misguided, that actually devolve upon every human being? and that we have an obligation to, number one, observe those obligations and promote those values, and not say that others who don't hold those obligations and don't preserve values are equal to a society that does. So I believe that people are equal before the law and equal before God in some theoretical sense. I don't believe that all societies and cultures are equal in a moral sense. Therefore, I sound intolerant. Okay? And that's perhaps the greatest sin when I was growing up, it was to sound intolerant. So now I'll have to say very frankly, and again, I hope you're with me on this, I actually am relatively intolerant of evil. I'm not tolerant of evil. I don't care if it's somebody's viewpoint. I don't care if it's someone's opinion. If they say, well, what do you mean by evil? In general, not respecting the life of innocent people. I call that evil. Okay, so I don't mind calling another society evil. So now let's look at the discourse of today, and then I'll stop. So now we're in this very complex situation of a war. Now, part of my training in religion social ethics was to study just war theory. Now, if you look that up on the internet, you look it up on any kind of source for books, you'll see many, many books on just war theory. Just war theory has been around since the Middle Ages. You'll actually find discussed in the Bible and in the Talmud, for example, the Bible says, when you are declaring war on a city, you have to leave the people corridor and avenue for exit. If a war breaks out, you got to let the innocent get out of there. Unless you think they're going to circle back and flank you and destroy you. Reasonably speaking, innocents may flee, relatively speaking. So you have laws of war, of just war theory scattered in the Bible. Now, the Talmud was not written when there was Jewish sovereignty, so it was more theoretical. But if you look, for example, in the Code of Maimonides, it's called the Mishnah Torah, there's a whole section on just war theory. He wasn't alone. All throughout the Middle Ages, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian theologians were discussing just war theory. And that has gone through the ages. It was part of the League of Nations. It's certainly part of the United Nations. So there is an arena called just war theory. So it's an attempt to articulate, you might say, the moral realism obligation not to hurt innocents down to the most complex and tragic arena of human interaction, which is warfare. And as I said last night, there's an a priori obligation not to harm innocents. It's a priori, exists in all places at all times, right? To avoid unnecessary intentional harm to the innocents. However, it's conditioned by the behavior of the enemy. And this is enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and War. Human Rights and War. You can look it up in the United Nations. I'll say what I said last night. To use civilians as a shield in warfare is a war crime. And if there's a war between, the UN is not trying to decide. They assume that there's a just war happening, and both sides may think it's just. Whatever the justice of the war from the viewpoint of the prosecutors of the war, human beings cannot be used as shields for a military purpose. That's a war crime. Okay, it's very clear. Now, I read something very distressing last night and this morning. There's photographic evidence that Gazans fleeing from North Gaza to South Gaza were massacred. There's video evidence. They're scattered down the street, and it seems to have all been by snipers. Fleeing from north to south, they can see it because they can see the ocean. On their right, they're fleeing from north to south. There's no bomb crater. People say, well, it's an Israeli bomb. They're strewn down a highway. No bomb crater, mostly headshots. Now the question is, what interest would the Israeli have in shooting fleeing civilians? None. What interest would Hamas have to murder fleeing civilians? Much. It's in the interest of Hamas that citizens not flee. Now we have to ask ourselves, by any definition of war crimes, that's a war crime. The loss of innocent life is tragic unless the other side is committing a war crime and using human shields. And what's the evidence that they're willing to commit war crimes? There's much evidence. This one that's been made public, I've been sent a video that I would never make public. It's too distressing. Of Hamas standing in streets and alleyways, catching people fleeing them, pulling them over to a ditch and shooting them in the head and throwing them into a ditch. There's a ditch filled with human bodies. Can't be verified. We don't know the date, but it just came out. I'll never, ever share it. But I want to tell you I've seen it. These are the same people who went into to the Gaza envelope and did the same kinds of atrocities. So it's not beyond them. So now just to bring it back to this situation, because you'll be asked, I'm a moral realist, the duty to preserve life. It's a real duty, not a societally constructed duty. It's not a subjective duty. It's a real duty, metaphysically obligated upon human beings. We have an a priori obligation to preserve the lives of others, conditional upon, for example, self-defense. If a person is attacking me, they have lost their right to life. That's clear in every tradition. Summarize all of this. If you're going to talk about moral realism, and I hope you're all committed to moral realism, meaning there really are better and worse answers to moral questions. Morals are not mores. If it's mores, just call them mores. Don't call them morals. If a person says, well, what are my moral obligations? You wise person who claims to understand moral realism, you can say, well, there's basically one basic one. The respect for lives of other human beings. It's a moral value, which translates into a moral obligation. And then you can say, but as a conditional value, for example, self-defense. All this is going to make sense to anybody, I hope. So it's not my private view that I have a moral obligation to respect life. It's a metaphysical reality to which I subscribe. You see the difference? It is my view, but it's my view because I think it's real. Just like a physicist, when a physicist studies reality, they don't have a view. Their view accords with reality. Well, if you look at most moral philosophers, they hold that morals is as real as mathematics. It's just as real. It's just not real in a physical, empirical sense. You will then be asked about the situation today, and I've given you the wherewithal to discuss moral realism, moral obligations in context situations such as warfare. Okay? And if I think that our youth would have been educated in a real understanding of moral obligations, and not only the moral obligation to be tolerant, which I don't think is a primary moral obligation. There's a moral obligation to be just more than there is to be tolerant. And I can tolerate an immoral person, but only so far. But we've taught them tolerance so much that then when they're faced with evil, they have a natural learned response of tolerance other than fighting evil. So we've sent our students into the lion's den of immoral people with no immunity to ideas that all views are the same. So I'd like us to turn this around. I need all of us to, first of all, be very convinced in this, and in a very careful way, deconstruct, take apart, dismantle the absolute value of tolerance that can only be under the absolute value of respect for life as understood in the moral philosophic tradition.